The Pacific War was a clash of extremes of cultures, climates, and machines. For the U.S. Marines, every island landing brought new surprises, new dangers, and new lessons. But few moments were as memorable or as revealing as the first time American troops came face-to-face with the Japanese Type 95 Hago tank. It was late 1942, on the battered, muddy island of Guadalcanal. The Marines had been fighting for weeks, pushing through jungle, mud, and relentless Japanese resistance. The enemy was tough, resourceful, and often fanatical. But when a patrol stumbled upon an abandoned Japanese tank near a shell-pocked coconut grove, what they found was not the steel monster they'd been led to expect. The tank was small, almost comically so compared to the hulking American M4 Sherman or even the lighter M3 Stuart. Its armor was thin, its lines boxy and simple. The Marines circled it, poking at the hull, peering inside, and laughing at the cramped interior. Someone banged on the side with a rifle butt. The sound was more like a tin can than a fortress. One Marine, grinning, pulled out his .50 caliber machine gun and fired a single round at the tank's side. The bullet punched straight through, leaving a neat hole on one side and a jagged exit on the other. The men burst out laughing. "You could throw a rock through this thing," one joked. Another said, "No wonder they left it behind." The Type 95 Hago was Japan's most common light tank of the war. Designed in the 1930s for speed and infantry support, it was never meant to go toe-to-toe with enemy armor. Its 37mm main gun was adequate against Chinese warlords and poorly equipped colonial forces, but against American tanks and anti-tank weapons, it was hopelessly outclassed. The Hago's armor was just 12mm thick on the sides, less than half an inch. Even the front plate was only 16mm. For comparison, the Sherman's front armor was 50mm, and its sides were 38mm. The Marines' laughter was more than just bravado. It was a release of tension, a moment of comic relief in a brutal campaign. But it was also a revelation. The men realized that not all enemy tanks were created equal. The Hago, which had seemed so fearsome in Japanese propaganda, was in reality a relic and artifact of a different kind of war. But the encounter also raised questions. Why would the Japanese send such a lightly armored tank into battle? What did it say about their strategy, their industry, and their understanding of modern warfare? And what did it mean for the Marines, who would face more and more of these machines as the island-hopping campaign continued? The answer lay in the very nature of the Pacific War. The islands were small, the terrain was rough, and the logistics were a nightmare. The Japanese needed tanks that could be shipped easily, moved quickly, and support infantry in jungle fighting. The Hago was perfect for that role, fast, simple, and easy to maintain. But as the war dragged on, and the Americans brought more firepower to bear, the Hago's weaknesses became impossible to ignore. For the Marines, the discovery of the Hago was both a confidence boost and a warning. It showed that American equipment was superior, that the industrial might of the United States was making a difference. But it also reminded them that the enemy was resourceful, willing to use whatever tools they had, and never to be underestimated. The story of the Hago became a legend among the Marines. Tales of 50 cal bullets punching through both sides of the tank were told and retold in mess tents and foxholes. The tank itself became a trophy, a symbol of American superiority and Japanese desperation. But the laughter masked a deeper truth. The Pacific War was still a deadly, grinding struggle, and every advantage had to be earned. But what was the real story behind the Hago's design? Why did the Japanese build such a lightly armored tank, and how did it fit into their overall strategy? In the next section, we dive into the history and philosophy of Japanese tank design and see why the Hago was both a product of its time and a victim of changing warfare. To understand why the Type 95 Hago was so lightly armored and why US Marines found it almost laughable, you have to go back to the 1930s, when Japan was building its empire across Asia. The Japanese army needed a tank that could be shipped easily to distant colonies, move quickly over rough terrain, and support infantry in the kind of wars they expected to fight against poorly equipped Chinese warlords, colonial police, and scattered guerrillas. The result was the Hago, a tank designed for a different world and a different kind of enemy. The Hago was small, light, and simple. Weighing just over 7 tons, it could be transported by ship, rail, or even towed by truck. Its 37mm main gun was enough to deal with machine gun nests, light vehicles, and infantry positions. The armor was thin, just 12mm on the sides, 16mm on the front, because the designers believed speed and mobility were more important than protection. In the jungles of China and Southeast Asia, that made sense. The Hago could move fast, cross rivers, and support infantry in places where heavier tanks would bog down. But by the time the Pacific War began, the world had changed. The Americans brought with them the M3 Stuart and, soon after, the M4 Sherman tanks with thicker armor, bigger guns, and more powerful engines. The .50 caliber machine gun, standard on every U.S. tank and many Marine units, could punch through the Hago's armor from almost any angle. The Hago, once a symbol of Japanese modernity, was now hopelessly outclassed. Japanese tank doctrine was also different from that of the US or Germany. The Imperial Japanese Army saw tanks primarily as infantry support weapons, not as independent armored spearheads. Their job was to help infantry break through enemy lines, not to fight other tanks. This philosophy was reflected in the Hago's design: light, fast, and easy to maintain, but not built for tank versus tank combat. The limitations of this approach became clear as soon as the Japanese faced well-equipped Allied forces. On Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Tarawa, Hagos were destroyed by bazookas, anti-tank guns, and even rifle grenades. Marines quickly learned that a .50 cal could go straight through both sides of the tank. In some cases, they used captured Hagos for target practice, amazed at how easily their bullets penetrated the armor. But the Hago's weaknesses were not just a matter of design, they were a reflection of Japan's industrial and logistical limits. Japan simply didn't have the resources to build thousands of heavy tanks. Steel was scarce, factories were few, and shipping space was at a premium. The Hago was cheap, easy to produce, and could be sent anywhere in the empire. For the Japanese, it was a compromise, a tank that could be everywhere, even if it couldn't stand up to American firepower. The Marines' reaction to the Hago was a mix of amusement and respect. They laughed at its thin armor and small size, but they also recognized the ingenuity behind its design. The Hago was a tank built for a different kind of war, a war of movement, improvisation, and limited resources. In the hands of a skilled crew, it could still be dangerous, especially in ambushes or against unsupported infantry. But as the war dragged on, the gap between Japanese and American equipment grew wider. The U.S. could afford to build bigger, better tanks to ship them across the Pacific and to supply them with endless ammunition and spare parts. The Hago, once a symbol of Japanese power, became a symbol of its limitations. The story of the Hago is a reminder that not all tanks are created equal. Design is always a compromise between firepower, protection, mobility, and cost. The Hago was perfect for the wars Japan expected to fight in the 1930s, but by 1944, it was hopelessly outmatched by the realities of modern, industrialized warfare. But what happened when the Hago actually faced American firepower in battle? In the next section, we lines go to the front lines with the Marines as they put the Hago's armor to the ultimate test and discover just how vulnerable it really was. The real test of any tank isn't T in the factory or on the drawing board at S on the battlefield. For the Japanese Type 95 Hago, that test came in the mud, jungle, and coral of the Pacific Islands. And when the US Marines finally faced the Hago in combat, the results were as dramatic as they were one-sided. The first major encounters came on Guadalcanal, where the Japanese tried to use their light tanks to break Marine lines and support infantry attacks. The Hago's small size and speed allowed it to move through jungle trails and cross rough ground, but its thin armor was a fatal weakness. Marines quickly learned that their .50 caliber machine guns mounted on tanks, half-tracks, and even some jeeps could punch straight through the Hago's hull and turret. In some cases, a single burst would go in one side and out the other, killing the crew and disabling the tank instantly. The Marines' reaction was a mix of shock and amusement. They had been trained to fear enemy tanks, to expect a tough fight, and to use bazookas or anti-tank grenades for armored threats. But the Hago was so lightly built that even rifle fire could sometimes penetrate the thinner parts of its armor. Marines joked that you could poke a hole in it with a bayonet or throw a rock through the side. The tank, that was supposed to be a symbol of Japanese power, became, in the eyes of many Americans, a rolling tin can. But the Hago was still dangerous in the right hands. Japanese crews used them for ambushes, hiding in the jungle or behind ridges and waiting for Marines to advance. In the chaos of battle, a Hago could appear suddenly, fire a few rounds, and then disappear into the undergrowth. The tank's speed and maneuverability made it hard to hit, and its small size allowed it to hide in places where larger tanks couldn't go. Still, the outcome was never in doubt. On Tarawa, Saipan, and later on Okinawa, the pattern repeated. Hagos were destroyed by bazookas, anti-tank guns, and even satchel charges. Marines used captured tanks for target practice, amazed at how easily their weapons could penetrate the armor. In one famous incident, a Marine squad used a .50 cal to shoot through both sides of a Hago, then posed for photos with the holes as proof. The psychological impact of these encounters was profound. For the Marines, the Hago became a symbol of American technological and industrial superiority. It was proof that the US could build better, stronger, and more effective weapons. For the Japanese, the loss of their tanks was a blow to morale and a stark reminder of their own limitations. But the story of the Hago is also a lesson in the realities of war. The tank was never meant to fight Shermans or withstand .50 cal fire. It was designed for a different kind of conflict, one where speed, mobility, and infantry support mattered more than armor thickness. In the jungles of China or the Philippines, the Hago was effective. In the face of American firepower, it was hopelessly outclassed. The Marines' laughter at the Hago's weakness masked a deeper respect for the enemy's ingenuity. Japanese crews made the most of what they had, using terrain, surprise, and determination to fight against impossible odds. The Hago may have been a tin can, but it was still a weapon, and in the hands of a determined crew, it could still kill. The encounters with the Hago also forced the Marines to adapt. They learned to use their .50 cals not just for infantry, but for tanks. They developed new tactics for dealing with light armor, using speed, firepower, and teamwork to overwhelm the enemy. The experience of fighting the Hago made the Marines more confident, more aggressive, and more willing to take risks. But what did the Hago's failure mean for Japanese strategy? In the next section, we explore how Japan tried to adapt to the growing power of American armor and why their efforts were too little, too late. The repeated failures of the Hago tank on the battlefield forced Japanese commanders and engineers to confront a harsh reality. Their armor was no match for American firepower. The US Marines' laughter at the Hago's vulnerability was just the beginning. As the Pacific Campaign ground on, the Japanese military scrambled to adapt, but the gap between their tanks and those of the Allies only grew wider. After the early defeats on Guadalcanal and Tarawa, Japanese planners recognized that the Hago was hopelessly outclassed. Reports from the front described tanks destroyed by machine gun fire, bazookas, and even rifle grenades. Crews were demoralized, and the loss of tanks often, without inflicting any significant damage on the enemy, became a source of frustration and shame. The Japanese army began to look for solutions. One response was to develop new tanks with thicker armor and bigger guns. The Type 97 Chiha, for example, was an improvement over the Hago, with a 57mm main gun and slightly better protection. Later models, like the Type 1 Chihi and Type 3 Chinu, featured even more upgrades. But these tanks were still light by Western standards, and production was slow. Japan's limited industrial base, shortages of steel, and constant Allied bombing made it nearly impossible to build enough new tanks to make a difference. Instead, the Japanese relied on tactics and improvisation. They dug their tanks into the ground, turning them into static pillboxes. They used camouflage, ambushes, and night attacks to try to offset their technical disadvantages. In some battles, they even used tanks as decoys, drawing American fire away from more important targets. But these measures were stopgaps at best. The Marines, with their superior firepower and combined arms tactics, adapted quickly. Flamethrowers, satchel charges, and close air support made short work of even the best Japanese defenses. The psychological impact of the Hago's failure was profound. Japanese tank crews, once proud of their machines, now dreaded going into battle. They knew that their armor would not protect them, that their guns were outmatched, and that the enemy was not afraid. Some crews abandoned their tanks at the first sign of trouble, preferring to fight on foot rather than die in a steel coffin. Others fought to the end, but the outcome was rarely in doubt. The Marines, for their part, never underestimated the enemy's determination. They respected the courage of Japanese tank crews, even as they marveled at the inadequacy of their equipment. The Hago became a symbol of the larger technological and industrial gap between Japan and the United States, a gap that would only widen as the war went on. American superiority was not just a matter of better tanks. It was the result of a vast, well-organized war machine that could produce, ship, and supply everything from tanks to trucks to ammunition. The US could afford to lose tanks and replace them. Japan could not. Every Hago lost was a blow to Japanese morale and a reminder of the limits of their empire. The failure of the Hago also had a ripple effect on Japanese strategy. As it became clear that their tanks could not stand up to American firepower, Japanese commanders shifted their focus to defensive tactics. They built elaborate networks of bunkers, tunnels, and caves, turning islands into fortresses. Tanks were used less as offensive weapons and more as mobile artillery or static strongpoints. The emphasis shifted from maneuver to attrition, from attack to defense. But even these adaptations could not change the outcome. The Marines, supported by overwhelming firepower and air superiority, continued to advance. Each new island brought new challenges, but the pattern remained the same. Japanese tanks were destroyed, their crews killed or captured, and the Marines moved on. The story of the Hago is a lesson in the dangers of underestimating the enemy, of failing to adapt quickly enough, and of relying on outdated technology in a rapidly changing war. It's also a testament to the courage of the men who fought in those tanks, who did their best with what they had, and who faced impossible odds with determination and honor. But what did the Marines themselves think about these encounters? In the next section, we'll hear first-hand accounts from American veterans how they reacted to the Hago, what it taught them about the enemy, and how it shaped their view of the Pacific War. For the U.S. Marines who fought their way across the Pacific, the Hago tank became a symbol of both the enemy's ingenuity and their limitations. The stories Marines told about the Hago, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with a shake of the head, reveal not just the technical gap between Japanese and American armor, but the human side of war, the surprise, the relief, and the respect that grew from facing a determined foe. Many Marines' first encounter with the Hago was a moment of disbelief. Corporal Bill Jenkins, who landed on Saipan in June 1944, remembered the first time his squad came across an abandoned Japanese tank. "We'd heard about Japanese tanks, but we expected something like our own. Instead, it looked like a toy. We banged on the side with a rifle butt, and it sounded hollow. Someone said, 'Let's see what a .50 can do.' The bullet went in one side and out the other. We all just started laughing. But the laughter was more than just bravado. It was a release of tension, a way to cope with the stress of combat. The Marines knew that every battle was a gamble, that the enemy was still dangerous, and that even a tin can could kill if you weren't careful. We never underestimated the Japanese," Jenkins said. "They were tough, and they'd fight to the last man. But when it came to tanks, we knew we had the edge." Other Marines recalled using the Hago for target practice. Sergeant Mike O'Donnell, a machine gunner on Peleliu, described how his squad would test their weapons on captured tanks. "We'd line up and take turns with the .50 cal. The rounds would punch right through. It was almost funny, but it also made you think, what were those poor guys supposed to do against a Sherman?" The Hago's vulnerability became a lesson in tactics Marines learned to use their .50 cals not just for infantry, but for tanks. They developed new ways to deal with light armor, using speed, firepower, and teamwork to overwhelm the enemy. The experience of fighting the Hago made the Marines more confident, more aggressive, and more willing to take risks, but the respect for the enemy was real. Marines who captured Hago crews or found the remains of tanks after a battle often spoke of the courage and determination of the Japanese soldiers. "They fought hard, even when they knew their tanks couldn't stop our bullets," said Lieutenant Tom Harris, who fought on Guam. "You had to respect that kind of bravery, even if you were glad you weren't in their shoes." The Hago also taught the Marines important lessons about the nature of war. It showed that technology alone wasn't enough, that tactics, training, and morale mattered just as much. It reminded them that the enemy was always adapting, always looking for new ways to fight. And it reinforced the importance of never underestimating the opposition, no matter how weak their equipment might seem. The stories of the Hago became part of Marine Corps' lore. They were told and retold in mess tents, at reunions, and in training classes for new recruits. The tank itself became a kind of mascot, a reminder of the challenges the Marines had overcome and the victories they had won. But the laughter was always tinged with respect. The Marines knew that the Hago was a product of its time, a reflection of Japan's industrial limits and strategic choices. They also knew that the men who fought in those tanks were just as brave, just as determined, and just as human as anyone else. The legacy of the Hago is a lesson in humility. It's a reminder that war is not just about machines, but about people, about the choices they make, the risks they take, and the courage they show in the face of adversity. The Marines who faced the Hago learned to respect their enemy, to trust their own training and equipment, and to never take victory for granted. But what did the Hago's story mean for the bigger picture of the Pacific War? In the final section, we explore how this humble tank became a symbol of the technological and industrial gap between Japan and the United States, and what it teaches us about the true nature of victory in war. The story of the Hago tank is more than just a footnote in the history of World War II. It's a window into the larger forces that shaped the Pacific War and a lesson in how technology, industry, and adaptability can decide the fate of nations. By the time the U.S. Marines were laughing at the Hago's thin armor, the outcome of the Pacific War was already being decided in factories, shipyards, and laboratories thousands of miles from the front lines. The United States, with its vast industrial base, could build tanks, planes, and ships faster than any other country on Earth. The Japanese, by contrast, were fighting with limited resources, outdated designs, and a shrinking pool of skilled workers. The Hago was a product of its time and place. Designed in the 1930s for colonial wars and infantry support, it was never meant to face the full might of American firepower. Its thin armor and light gun were adequate against poorly equipped enemies, but hopelessly outclassed by the 50 caliber machine guns, bazookas, and 75mm cannons of the U.S. Marines. The tank's very design, light, fast, and easy to transport, was a reflection of Japan's strategic needs and industrial limits. But as the war dragged on, those limits became fatal. The U.S. could afford to build bigger, better tanks, to ship them across the Pacific, and to supply them with endless ammunition and spare parts. The Hago, once a symbol of Japanese power, became a symbol of its limitations. Every time a Marine squad laughed as a 50 cal punched through a Hago, it was a reminder of the gap between the two nations, not just in technology, but in the ability to adapt and innovate. The Marines' encounters with the Hago also highlight the importance of flexibility and learning in war. The U.S. didn't just rely on superior equipment. It adapted tactics, trained its troops, and learned from every battle. The Marines used their 50 cals for anti-tank work, developed new assault techniques, and never underestimated the enemy's ability to surprise them. The Hago may have been a tin can, but it was still a threat in the hands of a determined crew. For the Japanese, the failure of the Hago was a lesson in the dangers of standing still. As the Americans brought new weapons and tactics to the battlefield, Japan struggled to keep up. Attempts to build better tanks came too late, and in too few numbers. The industrial and technological gap only widened as the war went on. The legacy of the Hago is a reminder that victory in war is about more than bravery or numbers. It's about the ability to innovate, to adapt, and to learn from failure. The Marines' laughter at the Hago was not just a sign of superiority, it was a sign that the U.S. had mastered the art of modern war, combining technology, industry, and human ingenuity to overcome any obstacle. Today, the story of the Hago is still told in Marine Corps museums, history books, and documentaries. It's a symbol of a bygone era, a lesson in the importance of never underestimating the enemy, and a tribute to the men who fought on both sides. The tank itself may have been obsolete, but the courage of its crews and the adaptability of their opponents are timeless. As you finish this documentary, think about what the Hago's story means for us now. Is it a lesson in the power of innovation? A reminder that no advantage lasts forever? Or simply a story of how technology, training, and the will to adapt can change the course of history? Whatever it is, let it inspire you to face your own challenges with the same spirit of determination and hope. If you've enjoyed this journey through the story of the Hago and the Marines who faced it, please like, comment, and subscribe for more untold World War II stories and deep dives into the technology and people that shaped history. What do you think is the most important lesson from the Hago's story? Share your thoughts below. We love hearing your take. Thank you for joining us on this march through history. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep remembering the real stories behind the legends.